We are going to talk about some interesting stuff today. Those of you who have heard me speak in the past, we are going to review a little bit of stuff that you may have heard previously because it's important to cover those foundations of the neuroscience, of what's going on inside the brain when someone is struggling with substance use disorders. And then we're going to sort of add in all the information of what's happening in the aging population that significantly complicates that and makes it even more complex. It's a growing demographic, all substance use across the board is a growing demographic. Like, we're seeing more and more substance use each year as time goes on, as you guys may have paid attention with the overdose numbers that are just now kind of plateauing, more so to life-saving techniques like Narcan. But in both Butler County and Allegheny County, the aging population is a significantly growing demographic. In fact, even nationally, like, these counties here locally rank very high in number of individuals and residents over the age of 65. In the world of healthcare, we are also doing a better and better job of managing chronic illnesses and late life illnesses, which is resulting in people living longer, right? So with that growth, we also see growth of, unfortunately, the substance use issues, everything from alcohol, prescription medications, and even some of the more hardcore illicit drugs, which we'll be talking about as we go through. But today, to kind of make this all flow well and help you understand it, we're going to start with just sort of an overall summary of addiction neuroscience, and then we're going to get into all the components that aging kind of brings into that. Now, you guys hear me talk a lot, or you may have in the past, about toxidromes versus behaviors. A toxidrome is a response from your physical body that you don't have control over. So these are things like, when somebody takes an opioid and their pupils become pinpoint, or when somebody takes a benzo and their pupils become dilated, or how it's affecting their breathing, how it's affecting their motor response. Those are all part of toxidromes that we are trained and educated to actually examine someone and watch for those toxidromes. Behaviors, that's more what we see sort of playing out in real life. Like, how is that person acting, right? Well, the two, we like to think that we are in control of behaviors, even though we know that we're not in control of toxidromes. But the truth is they are both being mediated by chemical changes in your brain and in your body. And so we're going to go through that, and I'm going to explain a little bit about how that actually works, starting with a slide that some of you may have seen before. This is when we look at the brain, and we look at how substance abuse is affecting the brain, this slide is very important, because you see those green dots in the middle of the brain? They don't show up super well because of the lighting, but you can see that most of the green dots are encircled here in the middle of the brain. When we look at substance of abuse, whether we're talking about alcohol, cocaine, opioids, whatever that substance is, if we tag it with a little radioactive isotope and then we watch where it goes in your brain whenever we inject it, this is where it goes, okay? It goes to that middle part of the brain, which is also known as the midbrain. And that's an important thing to understand because it turns out that part of the brain is very important. Now, you do see a little of the green dots up here in the motor cortex. That's how it can affect motor responses. You also see some in the sensory cortex, which is how it can affect sensation. But the bulk of it is in that midbrain, that middle part of the brain. I also want you to notice there's not a whole lot of green dots over here, but we'll come back to that in a minute, because we need to talk about what that midbrain is actually normally responsible for, and that is your limbic system, okay? The medical terminology for that midbrain is known as the limbic system. And excuse the cartoonish drawings, but your limbic system is what's keeping you alive on a day-to-week basis. So your limbic system is a very, very old part of your brain. I often call it the caveman part of your brain, because when we talk about cavemen and cavewomen, these are the kind of motivations that we're typically thinking of. They are driven mainly by a need for food, water, sex, shelter, safety, right? Like the caveman, like, where is woman, where is food, right? Like, we think of those kind of things when we think about a caveman. Well, it turns out that that part of your brain is so important that it constantly drives you towards these things even when you don't really realize it. And we're going to talk about that a little bit more in a moment. But with the limbic system being responsible for these mechanisms of survival, what happens when that limbic system gets sort of hijacked by a drug, right? Now all of a sudden, the brain is getting dopamine and that part of the limbic system, which it normally associates with survival. Okay, so that's very important. And anybody who watches somebody who struggles significantly with a severe substance use disorder will watch that person forego food, water, sex, safety, shelter, in ways that don't really make sense to the rest of us, okay? That's part of it, okay? That's part of why the neuroscience of addiction is so complex, but it actually gets even more interesting than that. This prefrontal cortex is a very important part of your brain, and remember I said there weren't many dots right here? That's where your prefrontal cortex is actually located, right behind your forehead, right above your eyes, okay? And your prefrontal cortex, that's the most intelligent part of your brain. It's actually the one part of the brain that human beings have that no other species on the planet has. So even our closest cousins like chimpanzees and orangutans, we might share 99% of our DNA with them, but that 1% makes all the difference because that 1% is what gives us our prefrontal cortex. You share 60% of your DNA with a banana, right? So a little bit of a difference can make a lot of difference, right? Whenever it comes to DNA. So the prefrontal cortex though, that really intelligent part of your brain, that's where all the things that make you smart are coming from. Everything like when you're predicting an outcome or when you are logically analyzing something or when you're thinking about like, okay, what are the short-term consequences versus the long-term gains? That's all coming from that higher executive functioning of the prefrontal cortex. So people will often ask, okay, well, why can't we just rationalize or reason our way out of addiction? That's a very good question, okay? And the neuroscience tells us why, okay? Because there is something called neuronal hierarchy, okay? And what neuronal hierarchy basically says is that the new parts of the brain will always be bypassed and overrun by the older parts of the brain if their needs are not met. So let me explain this in ways that everybody can understand. You guys have all seen those Russian nesting dolls where you open one and there's another one, and then you open that one and there's another one, and it keeps getting smaller and smaller and smaller, right? Well, our brains actually formed in the opposite direction, right? The newer layers were added to the outside. They weren't added deep in. It was literally added one layer on top of another, on top of another, kind of like the layers of sediment and rock in geology, right? Well, what that tells us is this outer portion of your brain is the newest portion of your brain. Now, in the world of neuroscience, we don't call that the new brain, we call it neocortex. Neo means new, cortex means outer shell. But as you go deeper and deeper, you get to older parts of the brain from an evolutionary standpoint. So in the world of evolutionary biology, they call that outermost layer the neo-mammalian layer because only the newest mammals, i.e. humans, actually have that layer. You go a little bit deeper where you get to that midbrain, they call that the paleo-mammalian or limbic system because you can trace it back to the Paleolithic time period and every mammal has a limbic system. Okay, and we'll talk a little bit more about that as we go, but if you go really deep into the brain, you get to the reptilian brain. This is the oldest part of the brain. This is the part of the brain that we share with like reptiles and amphibians. Well, there's a very important part of neuronal hierarchy that basically says that the new parts of the brain will be bypassed and overrun by the old parts of the brain when their needs are not met, and I often find that the best way to explain this is with an example, okay? I have a bottle of water up here, and it's been sitting up here since I started my talk, and I'm willing to bet that most of you did not even notice my bottle of water. However, this is more important for your survival than most things in this room, right? You would actually die if you went 3 days without this bottle of water. So why are our brains not focusing on every bottle of water that we see? Well, it's because you're hydrated, right? Your limbic system needs are met. You've had something to eat or drink in the past 24 hours, and if you haven't, you've at least had something in the past 72 hours. Because if you didn't, you wouldn't be making eye contact, you wouldn't be sitting here listening to me talk, you would be making a beeline for whatever water you could find, okay? So if you're sitting in here right now and you're using that smart part of your brain and you're listening to this lecture, or maybe you're thinking about what you need to do whenever you leave here later today, well, if our circumstances changed and we became trapped in this room for 3 or 4 days, you would only be thinking about getting your hands on water, okay? It would actually change your behaviors completely. Not only would you be obsessing about my water, you would actually consider doing things that you would never otherwise consider doing. You would consider murdering me for my bottle of water. And a lot of people will say, no way, I'm a God-fearing Christian. I would never do such a thing. Yes, you would. And in fact, you would get with the people that are closest to you in your life, whether it be somebody that you played a sport with or somebody that you know from your church outings. You would find people because that survival mechanism is all coming from your limbic system. So tribalism, also comes from your limbic system, okay? Because your brain learned over all of those years that if you needed to survive, well, if you got with other people that were like-minded and shared some of your DNA, that you were more likely to survive. In fact, it gets really interesting. They've actually calculated how quickly you'll recruit a first cousin versus a second cousin versus a third cousin. The closer they are in DNA to you, the more you're going to recruit them to help you in your cause. And here's where it gets even a little bit darker, a little bit stranger. I could take anybody and say you don't have anybody in that room that you know. You don't have anybody that you were on a team with or that you shared anything with. If I put you in a room full of strangers, you would gravitate towards the people who look like you, sound like you, maybe speak the same language as you, maybe they follow the same religion as you, maybe they're from the same country as you or the same state or the same school district. And that happens not on the conscious prefrontal cortex. That's coming from old survival parts of your brain. You can literally do it with babies. You take a bunch of babies that can crawl, you put them all in a room together, and they will gravitate towards other babies that look and sound like them. People don't like to talk about that because they think it's racism. It's not racism, it's tribalism. It's this old part of your brain. Those babies aren't thinking about it, they're just naturally doing it because it was something that actually improved their chance of survival down the road. Okay, so why does this matter? Well, because we're gonna take this story a little bit further. Let's say that you are in here now and you are thinking about murdering me for my bottle of water. Could I get your brain to stop doing that? Well, I could, if I activated the reptilian part of your brain. Okay, this is the oldest part of the brain, and it's also the strongest part of the brain, because while the limbic system is keeping you alive over days to weeks, your brain stem, your reptilian brain, is actually keeping you alive from 1 minute to the next. So this is where your breathing comes from. This is where your heart rate comes from. All your vital signs are coming from that reptilian part of your brain. So from a common sense standpoint, you don't even need to think that much into it. Is this guy still plotting to steal my water? He's not, right? Because his brain knows that if he doesn't solve this problem in the next 3 minutes, there's no need to worry about something that he needs every 3 days, right? This is why it's so difficult to talk people out of addiction, right? You can't do it. I've tried thousands of times with family members. You sit people down who are struggling, and that person can sit in their prefrontal cortex, and they can rationalize in that moment, and they can say, you're right, I don't want to do this anymore, and I've caused a lot of destruction, and this is not consistent with how I want my life to be. I promise you, I'm not going to pick up that pill or powder or plant or whatever the problematic substance may be. They can give all the promises in the world, but then what continues to happen? Well, they go out into the real world, that brain chemistry starts to change, that limbic system kicks into overdrive because it wants that drug that it interprets as needing for survival, and that prefrontal cortex goes offline. And the person will even explain this to you. They will say, like, I don't understand. I have every intention of honoring that promise. I have every intention of following through with that plan, but something happens and I go on autopilot. And all I can think of is, how can I get that substance back in my body? That's because of neuronal hierarchy. Does that make sense to everybody? Okay. We're going to keep going. Neuroplasticity is another part of it, which is also super interesting. And neuroplasticity tells us that your brain is constantly changing, and it is constantly changing on everything based on everything that it's experiencing in the real world. Your brains in here listening to me right now, like it or not, they are changing in response to that. Now, it may be changing in a way that's going to benefit you. Sometimes these changes can actually impact you negatively. Okay, let's talk a little bit about neuroplasticity. So this is what neurons look like in like X-Men and Marvel movies, but it's easier to learn on a two-dimensional picture like this. And these are all different types of neurons. Well, these neurons, we know now from neuroplasticity that they are dynamic. There is plasticity there. That's the opposite of being fixed and rigid and unchanging, right? And everything you do that feels good, you get a change in your brain. Let me explain what I mean by that, okay? Let's say that you do something later today that's really enjoyable. It could be buying a scratch-off ticket that you hit on. It could be even walking outside and the sun hits your face, right? Oh, feels good. It feels good because you got a little squirt of dopamine in your brain. But what neuroplasticity tells us is that there is actually a structural change in your brain at that moment. And it can be subtle. It can just be this neuron sending out a new branch to its neighbor, or this neuron pulling a branch back from her neighbor. But there is a structural change in your brain in that moment from doing that thing that felt good. And people will say, like, that doesn't make sense. I don't feel different. I don't feel like another person. How can you say my brain changed? Well, your brain changed and you did not feel it in that moment because you actually have 200 billion neurons. That's a lot of neurons, right? And each one of those neurons can have anywhere from dozens to thousands of connections to its neighbor. So you're talking about quadrillions of connections, and one of them changed. You're gonna feel that in that moment? No, you're not gonna feel that any more than like if I flick a cup off the railing of the Titanic. You're not gonna feel that boat sway, right? But if those changes are happening again and again and again, well, we don't have to guess what happens. The technology has caught up. We can scan people and you can actually see those changes in the brain happening over time. And here's another really dark part of that story. Why is your brain changing? Your brain is changing because it wants you to do that same thing again. Your brain is changing because it typically got that dopamine from things like food, water, sex, safety, shelter, things that were hard to come across in a very difficult natural world. We live in a world right now where those things don't serve us as well, right? Because we live in a world of convenience. Like, we have access to safety, we have access to shelter. But your brain 100,000 years ago did not have easy access to those things. So when you accomplished one of those things, it wanted to not only remember exactly how you did it, but it wanted to change your brain to make it more likely for you to do it again. And this is where it becomes very problematic with substance use, right? Because every time that person uses that substance, that brain is changing in ways that are making it more likely for them to continue using that substance. Even if they were just experimenting and they're saying, like, I don't want to keep going down this rabbit hole. I went from 2 Percocets to 4 Percocets. I'm not going to 5. Well, their brain is going to continue to change. The neuroplasticity is going to continue to rewire, and that rabbit hole is going to continue. Okay, so let's get into some of the newer stuff here as far as, like, briefly on mental health. Mental health actually has a lot to do with neuronal hierarchy too. Mental health, we talk about like emotions and how you're feeling. Well, I'm gonna show you a couple of slides that you just went through to show you how you've already learned this, okay? And by the way, both the mental health crisis and the substance use crisis are both worsening, and in today's world, it's actually not that surprising when you think about it. So this slide earlier, we talked about the prefrontal cortex and all the reason and logic and all these higher executive function intelligent things that come from the prefrontal cortex. We talked a little bit about the limbic system and how it's driving you towards all of those survival things, but emotions come from the amygdala, and they are actually coming from your limbic system. This is the reason why we all think our dogs and our cats are so intelligent, right? Because all mammals have a limbic system. So when you see that animal, you can see emotion because emotion comes from the limbic system. So you can see when that dog is happy or sad or terrified or anxious, right? Doesn't mean it has a prefrontal cortex. Doesn't mean it's logically predicting what you're going to do. It's just pattern recognition and emotions. Okay, and those emotions are helping to drive that animal towards those same things: food, water, sex, safety, and shelter, right? So the reason why this matters with emotions is because it's the same thing when that limbic system goes into overdrive. When the emotions coming from the midbrain, if somebody is very emotionally worked up or triggered emotionally, which that's actually a neuroscience term, you are actually stimulating their fight, flight, or freeze. That's a survival mechanism that's coming from the limbic system. So what happens in that moment is their prefrontal cortex goes offline. And we used to tell people that. We used to say, like, hey, don't make any smart decisions when you're really emotional, when you're really worked up. You'll probably make a bad decision. We don't give people that same advice anymore, though we should be doing that. But emotions, they basically happen because when you swing towards that sympathetic nervous system, instead of there being a grizzly bear, your brain is behaving like there's a grizzly bear. It is going into extreme fight, flight, or freeze, And you can actually see this happen with panic attacks, with anxiety attacks, all those sorts of things. Well, all of the emotions coming from that amygdala can impact, how well you are able to use that smart part of your brain in that prefrontal cortex. And that's going to matter as we go into some of this aging stuff. So the point on neuroplasticity is that your brain is always changing. It's changing based on what it is experiencing externally and internally. So you have to be very carefully choose what you are exposing your brain to and what you are putting in your body because of those changes. So as you can see from the first part of that talk, neuroscience addiction is very complex. It is not something that is easy to overcome. This is why it's so difficult to send somebody away for 30 or even 90 days and have incredibly high success rates, right? Stabilizing in recovery is challenging not just for the young and resilient, but particularly for the aging population as well. And we're going to go through the reasons why and understand what differences and challenges this brings about. So this was a funny little thing in medical school, that they would often say that as we get into these older years, some things get smaller, some things get bigger, some things hang lower, and some things go slower. Okay, so let's just go through some of these. So things that get smaller, right? There's various things, everything from even the height and bone density of a person, right? As we age, they start to get a little bit smaller, particularly in the 6th and 7th decades of life. There is also shrinking of the outer cortex of the brain. That's called cortical atrophy. I'm going to show you some pictures of that next, okay? But muscle atrophy, there's various things that start, you kind of peak in your mid-20s as from a physiology standpoint, and then things start to decline, and even in your late 30s, early 40s, all of these things are starting to actually decline. They just do it more slowly until you get into that 6th and 7th decade. Some things are getting bigger, right? Ask a man who has prostate issues, right? That thing continues to kind of swell up. There's other things too. Even things like cartilaginous things, like, a nose, right? I'm Italian. I look at my great uncle. He can't even see past his nose. I'm like, uh-oh, I'm in trouble, right? So there's things that are getting smaller. There's things that are getting bigger. There's things that are hanging lower. Mine's out of the gutter, people. I'm talking about earlobes. I'm just kidding. Obviously, we're talking about some, private parts of our body too, but that's because collagen starts to break down. Elastin starts to get more lax. And so all of these things, it's all changes in our physiology, and that matters. When our physiology is changing, our brain physiology is changing as well. And then things that go slower, various things related to metabolism, even the firing of some of those neurons. And so let's talk a little bit about that. So cerebral atrophy is one of the things that it's actually so common that when somebody comes into the ER and we do a brain scan on somebody in their 70s or 80s, it will typically say expected amount of cerebral atrophy, okay? It's common because it happens across the board. Well, what it means is this outer layer. That outer layer is actually called the gray matter. That's where the neurons, the cell bodies, are most highly condensed. The white matter, what's kind of in the middle, those are the projections that those neurons are sending down. Basically like the wire that it's sending down the spinal cord so that it can send that signal out to the rest of the body, right? So when you get that cortical atrophy, it matters quite a bit. And I want you to notice here that because the hippocampus is located on this little corner down here, you do get shrinking of the hippocampus as well. That's really important for memory formation. Your hippocampus is one of the most vital parts of your brain when it comes to storing short-term memories, which is why it can affect, memory recall and all of those things. In the breakout session, we're going to go deeper down that whole memory impairment rabbit hole. These are different stages of cerebral atrophy, and this is how it looks when we're looking at brain scans, in the hospital. And you can clearly see there's more dark coloration and space in not just around the brain, but in what's called the sulci as well. Okay, the sulci are those little folds, going kind of in and out. Complexities with the aging population, they are very widespread, right? So as we all age, we start to develop other chronic conditions that can kind of play a role in our medical care and our overall well-being. We tend to have more problems related to neurology, everything related to, strokes and Parkinson's and dementia, orthopedic issues, so osteoarthritis or, a hip fracture, something along those lines. Rheumatoid issues, autoimmune conditions, endocrine issues. Endocrine glands often begin begin to fail over time, which is why we have to replace thyroid. We have to help that insulin put the sugar into cells. But you also have adrenal hormones, pituitary hormones, and others. And all of that changes as we all age. The younger the brain, the higher the degree of neuroplasticity. And neuroplasticity does significantly slow down around age 75. Okay, that matters because neuroplasticity works in the opposite direction as well. So when we're trying to get somebody better through recovery, we're trying to stabilize that substance use disorder. Well, it can get harder, especially after that sixth decade of life. And it doesn't mean that there's no hope. It just means that there are new challenges that are brought to the table. Memory impairment, this is what my breakout session is going to be, but just understand that there are various levels of memory impairment, and up to 50% of people over the age of 65 will experience some level of memory impairment. It's not all dementia, okay? There's actually age-associated memory decline, and then as you get a little more serious, you get into cognitive impairment, and then you get into all the different types of dementia, which is what we'll be doing in the breakout. But this can be very tricky because when we're talking about using substances like alcohol and benzos and opioids, a lot of times it could be like, well, are they not remembering that because of the memory impairment associated with their aging? Or are they not remembering that because benzos also have an amnestic effect and alcohol also has an amnestic effect? And so it can be very challenging in that regards. And they can become confused even if they're taking medication simply as prescribed, because it can be, wait, did I take that medication yet? And they can actually double a dose. I mean, I've dealt with this within my own family as well. Those pharmaceutical complexities expand well beyond that, including polypharmacy issues, understanding the difference between a scheduled medication and a medication that is to be taken as needed. And we typically, in the past, we had PCPs that could spend a little more time. They could actually keep an eye on these things. Your PCP now has 11 to 13 minutes to see you before they have to get in with the next patient. That's not enough time. We have changed and exchanged quality for quantity. And that has a lot to do with the business side of healthcare. And it's something that I very much disagree with, but I'm not in charge. So, but I'm sure you guys have felt the impact of that in your personal and family lives as well. Also, we have supplement use. Holy crap, I can't tell you how many supplements are being used in the aging population. I mean, they come into the ER and their prescription bag is this big and their supplement bag is a garbage bag that the spouse is carrying in because it was too heavy, like literally. I mean, and then you start going through and they have no idea, well, I saw a commercial for that one time. And a lot of times don't understand that there's no FDA regulation. There's no safety process with a lot of those supplements. So that absolutely throws a monkey wrench into this. I'm not gonna spend a lot of time on financial complexities, but understand that this does matter and it does have an impact. If your family is well off, well, you're gonna have access to a lot more resources. If you're restricted to Medicare and Medicaid, that's also gonna determine what sort of access to care you have. And even further than that, we have to consider that there are certain financial things that will even drive somebody further down that pathway. For every person that I have met in Butler County who was addicted to drugs, they've told me a story about an aging person that they were buying the prescriptions from early on in their substance use disorder. It is so common because we have people in that demographic that can't pay their rent and they can't put food in their fridge. So they get a prescription for a medication and, hey, somebody's gonna pay me 10 bucks a pill for that? Okay, I'll sacrifice 20 of those pills, and now all of a sudden they have a means to be able to pay that bill. And if you're not talking about all of those things, you're not doing it justice. There's even social challenges. The brain is wired, the human brain is wired for socializing. And I'm not talking about social media. That's not real socialization. That's attention. It is faking socialization. It makes you feel like you're connected to all these people. You say one wrong thing, all those people are gonna turn on you, right? Like that is not real connection. That's not real socialization. And in the aging population, real socialization becomes more difficult, right? Because mobilization becomes more difficult. Driving may become more difficult. A lot of their friends may have passed away. They might not have the same, circles as they had previously to call upon. And all of those things matter. And remember that addiction and isolation always go hand in hand, and just like recovery and community go hand in hand. So that has a significant impact as well. Family challenges, we see these across the board. I'm sure some of you who work in the homes have seen a lot of this as well. Joe and I heard about that from some different groups that we would go and talk with. Because the challenges range widely from a family member who is maybe a little bit overly controlling of that patient, maybe even manipulating that patient to get certain meds that they want access to. Okay, those are things that you always have to consider. Sometimes it is more the surrounding that makes it difficult, than what the patient is dealing with themselves. And I'm not saying all those family interactions are negative. There's certainly plenty of positive ones as well. But without actually exploring it and figuring out the facts, you don't really know what's going on at home. Consequences of these complexities. Things in the ER we see an increased number of falls and injuries. A patient who's 82 years old and taking a benzo and an opioid is going to have a difficult time with coordination and ambulation, right? Motor vehicle crashes, I can't tell you how many times it's a fender bender, they're brought to the ER, their pupils are dilated and they can barely keep their eyelids open. It's like, did you take your Xanax right before you drove? I think I might have, and so these things happen across the board. Visits to the ED with a broad range of different presentations, accidental overdoses from taking one, and a lot of times it's recognized by family and they bring them in and they're like, I don't know, I'm counting their pills, it's not really adding up to what they're supposed to be taking, and that's whenever these things start to sort of come to light. Confusion of the loved ones, like we just talked about, unexpected withdrawal symptoms because they don't realize that taking that medication 3 times a day is actually going to be problematic whenever they decide not to take that medication, and the complexities for home health. In other words, managing substance use and abuse in general is very, very complex, but when you add in all of the unique features that the aging population brings into the story, it increases those complexities greatly. What do we need moving forward? Well, a lot of things. We need better education and training for medical providers. We need more resources and support for the aging population. We need monitoring and educating people on how to appropriately monitor. We need family education and support. We need the tech integrated solutions, which vary widely. I mean, right now, like people are still using like the pill boxes, that are basically like Sunday through Saturday, right? And you fill up those pill boxes and that at least gives you a little bit of organization and a little bit of a way to kind of, assist that person. But I've heard of some of these other machines that are coming down the pipeline where literally you load all the week's medications into it and electronically it will dispense exactly what's due at the time that it is due. And so that removes confusion. Now, those systems, they're not cheap yet, but they will be over time. They can actually scan the pill and based on the color and what's stamped on it, they can determine what that pill is, okay? So there's a lot of things like that can be helpful, and right now we're still using like simple life alert, tags around a necklace, around a lanyard, but there's a lot of other very interesting and cool tech devices that are coming down the pipeline that should be helpful and help us actually support this demographic, and then community support systems. Everything from, an actual place that people can go to get that positive socialization, to things like just checking on neighbors, just neighbors checking on neighbors. Like that happens less and less in today's world as well, and that can be problematic. My main take-home points for the keynote is that addiction is a complex pathology and is a result of complex neurophysiology, and we need to understand that. Hopefully you guys understand at this point, like it's not just make a better decision, right? They are going up against all of that neuroplasticity that has changed in the wrong direction, and that takes a long time to kind of move that back into a healthy brain state. The chemical changes in the brain are what result in the problematic behaviors. In the aging population, additional complexities do exist. Therefore, there's a greater importance on education, training, and monitoring, and support resources should not just include the patient, but all of the support systems around them as well. And as this demographic continues to grow, it's only going to become more complex, and so we need to get ahead of this now as well as we can. That's all I had for the keynotes. Thank you, everybody. I appreciate it.